The old man didn't argue. Even after two security guards grabbed him by the arms and pushed him toward the courtroom doors, he simply tightened his grip on the worn leather folder pressed against his chest. The courtroom was already full. Lawyers whispered. Reporters checked their cameras. Families waiting for their own hearings looked over with quiet amusement. Someone laughed. Wrong courtroom, Grandpa. Another voice followed. He probably wandered in looking for free air conditioning. Even the bailiff shook his head. Sir, this hearing is for property fraud involving millions of dollars. You don't belong here. The old man looked at him calmly. I do. His voice wasn't loud. It wasn't angry. It was steady. Nobody listened. The expensive attorney representing the wealthy developer glanced over with a smirk before turning back to organize his papers. The developer himself smiled confidently. This is exactly why court security needs better screening. More laughter. The old man remained silent. His shoes were worn. His coat had been carefully repaired more than once. Nothing about him suggested importance. Then something unexpected happened. The courtroom doors opened again. Everyone instinctively stood. The judge entered. She carried the case file in one hand, but the moment her eyes landed on the old man being forced toward the exit, she stopped walking. The room became strangely quiet. The judge stared at him for several long seconds. Her expression changed from confusion to disbelief, and finally to deep respect. The bailiff noticed first. Your Honor. Without taking her eyes off the old man, she quietly said. Release him. Nobody moved. I said. Her voice became sharper. Release Mr. Elijah Brooks. Immediately. The guards let go. The attorney frowned. The developer suddenly looked uneasy. Then the judge spoke words that froze every person in that courtroom. Every person in this room will remain standing. She closed the case file. And before today's hearing continues, I believe everyone deserves to know exactly who this man really is. The silence that followed was heavier than any verdict. No one was laughing anymore. And what the judge revealed next would completely change the outcome of the case, and the lives of everyone who had underestimated him. The security guard tightened his grip on the old man's arm, guiding him toward the courtroom doors as if he were an inconvenience that needed to disappear before the proceedings began. Around them, quiet chuckles rippled through the crowded room. Lawyers in tailored suits exchanged amused glances, while spectators leaned toward one another, whispering assumptions about the elderly stranger who had somehow wandered into a high-profile trial. Elijah Brooks never resisted. He simply adjusted the worn leather folder under his arm and walked with steady, measured steps. His weathered overcoat showed careful repairs along one sleeve, and although his shoes had clearly seen many years, they were polished until they reflected the courtroom lights. His calm expression contrasted sharply with the embarrassment others expected him to feel. I'm telling you, sir, the bailiff said, trying to keep his patience, this courtroom is reserved for parties involved in today's hearing. If you're looking for legal aid, someone downstairs can help you. I appreciate your concern, Elijah replied softly, but I'm exactly where I need to be. The words drew another wave of laughter. A young associate from the developer's legal team smirked. Confidence is admirable, he whispered to a colleague, even when it's completely misplaced. Across the aisle sat Victor Langston, the wealthy real estate developer whose company stood accused of forcing dozens of families from their homes through fraudulent property transfers. Dressed in a perfectly tailored navy suit, Victor glanced briefly toward the disturbance before dismissing it with an impatient sigh. Can we get started? He muttered to his attorney. I didn't come here to watch security deal with confused retirees. His attorney smiled politely. It'll only take a moment. Elijah paused just short of the exit doors. He looked once around the courtroom, not with fear or frustration, but with the quiet observation of someone noticing details others overlooked. His eyes rested briefly on the evidence table, then on the judge's empty bench. Finally, he looked at the large clock mounted above the courtroom doors. They're almost here, he murmured. The nearest guard frowned. Who's almost here? Elijah simply smiled. Before anyone could press him further, the courtroom doors behind the judge's bench opened. All rise. The bailiff's commanding voice echoed through the room. Conversations stopped instantly as everyone stood. Chairs scraped against the polished floor, and every eye turned toward Judge Naomi Carter as she entered carrying a thick case file. Her expression was focused, the look of someone prepared for a long and difficult day. She took 3 measured steps toward the bench. Then she stopped. Her eyes locked onto the elderly man standing beside the exit. For several seconds, the room remained perfectly still. Confusion flickered across her face before giving way to unmistakable recognition. The stern professionalism she carried into every courtroom softened into genuine surprise. "Mr. Brooks," she said quietly. No one answered. The guards looked at one another, uncertain whether the judge could possibly be addressing the old man they had been escorting out. Judge Carter set her case file down without taking her eyes off Elijah. "Release him." The words were calm but unmistakably firm. The guards hesitated. "Your Honor," one of them began, "he isn't listed." "I said release him." This time her voice carried enough authority to silence every objection. The guards immediately stepped back. Elijah straightened his coat, nodded politely to both men, and thanked them as though they had done him a kindness instead of humiliating him. Judge Carter descended from the bench instead of taking her seat, an action so unusual that every lawyer in the room stared in disbelief. She walked directly toward Elijah, stopping only a few feet away, her eyes filled with respect that no one present could understand. The whispers returned, but now they carried confusion instead of mockery, and Victor Langston's confident smile slowly began to disappear as he realized the quiet old man was far more important than anyone had imagined. Judge Naomi Carter stood before Elijah Brooks for a long moment, the entire courtroom watching in stunned silence. Then, to everyone's amazement, she extended her hand. "Mr. Brooks," she said warmly, "it's an honor to see you again." Elijah accepted the handshake with a gentle smile. "The honor is mine, Your Honor." No one moved. No one spoke. The attorneys exchanged puzzled glances, unable to understand why one of the state's most respected judges was greeting an elderly man in worn clothes with such unmistakable respect. Victor Langston leaned toward his attorney. "Who is he?" he whispered. The attorney frowned. I don't know." Victor looked irritated. "Then find out." Judge Carter slowly turned toward the courtroom. "You may all be seated." The room obeyed, though the atmosphere had completely changed. Moments earlier, people had been laughing at Elijah. Now they sat with anxious curiosity, sensing that something important was unfolding. The judge remained standing. "There will be a brief delay before today's hearing begins." Victor's attorney rose immediately. "Your Honor, with respect, this case has already been delayed twice. My client would appreciate." Judge Carter raised one hand. "Counselor, I wasn't asking for permission." The attorney immediately sat down. Judge Carter looked across the courtroom, allowing the silence to settle. "Before we continue, there is something every person in this room needs to understand." Her gaze returned to Elijah. "Many of you looked at this gentleman and decided who he was before hearing a single word from him." Several people lowered their eyes. The assumptions made in this courtroom over the last 5 minutes are exactly why justice requires more than appearances. A reporter quietly reached for her notebook. Camera operators outside the courtroom windows pressed closer, sensing an unexpected story. Judge Carter continued, "When I was 23 years old, I nearly gave up on law school." The room listened intently. "I was overwhelmed, burdened by debt, and convinced I wasn't capable of becoming the lawyer I hoped to be." She smiled faintly. "One evening, a professor introduced me to a man who volunteered his evenings mentoring young law students." She turned slightly toward Elijah. "That man was Mr. Elijah Brooks." Soft murmurs spread across the courtroom. "He never asked for recognition. He never accepted payment. He simply believed that knowledge meant nothing unless it was shared." Elijah lowered his eyes modestly. Judge Carter continued, "The lessons he taught me about integrity have guided every decision I've made on this bench." Victor shifted uneasily in his chair. His confidence was beginning to crack. A respected mentor was impressive. But surely that wasn't enough to stop today's proceedings. He leaned toward his attorney again. "So he's a retired teacher." The attorney didn't answer. Instead, he had begun searching through electronic legal records on his tablet. His expression slowly changed. His fingers stopped moving. His eyes widened. Victor noticed. "What?" The attorney swallowed. I think I've found him." And, the attorney stared at the screen in disbelief. "This can't be right." Victor snatched the tablet. Across the display appeared a series of decades-old legal publications, landmark constitutional arguments, and judicial citations. One name appeared again and again. Elijah Brooks, referenced in appellate decisions, quoted in law journals, cited by state and federal courts. Victor looked up at the old man standing quietly beside the judge. His heartbeat quickened. This has to be another Elijah Brooks." Before the attorney could respond, Judge Carter spoke again. "There's one more fact the court should know." Every eye returned to her. "Mr. Brooks is not here as a spectator." The room fell silent once more. He is here because the evidence he preserved for nearly 20 years may determine the outcome of this entire case. Victor's face lost its color. He slowly looked toward the worn leather folder still resting beneath Elijah's arm. Only now did he realize the old folder everyone had ignored might contain something far more dangerous than anyone in the courtroom had imagined. A heavy silence settled over the courtroom as every pair of eyes fixed on the worn leather folder tucked beneath Elijah Brooks's arm. Just minutes earlier, it had looked like nothing more than an old man's personal belongings. Now it carried an entirely different weight. Even the reporters in the back of the room stopped whispering, afraid to miss a single word. Victor Langston forced himself to smile, though the confidence behind it was fading. "Your Honor," he said as he stood, "with respect, I fail to see how an unidentified folder changes the facts of this case." Judge Carter looked at him steadily. "Mr. Langston, you'll have every opportunity to speak. For now, you'll allow the court to proceed." Victor reluctantly sat down, tapping his fingers against the table. His attorney leaned closer. "If those records are genuine, we may have a problem." "What kind of problem? I don't know yet. You'd better find out." At the front of the courtroom, Elijah carefully placed the leather folder on the evidence table. His movements were slow and deliberate, almost ceremonial, as though he understood that every paper inside represented years of trust placed in his hands. Judge Carter nodded. "Mr. Brooks, would you please explain to the court why you've kept those documents for so long?" Elijah rested one hand on the folder before answering. "Because some promises don't expire." His quiet words echoed through the silent room. 20 years ago, several families came to me after they lost their homes. They believed documents had been altered, signatures forged, and records hidden. They wanted justice, but they didn't have the money to keep fighting. He paused, looking around the courtroom. "So I told them that if the truth ever found its way back into the light, I would be there to help carry it." Several members of the audience exchanged uneasy glances. Elijah opened the folder. Inside were dozens of carefully organized files, each separated by handwritten tabs that had faded with age. Every page had been preserved inside protective sleeves despite the years. He removed the first document and handed it to the court clerk. The original land transfer agreement. Then another. The notarized survey completed before ownership changed. Another followed. Letters exchanged between county officials. And another. Statements from witnesses who feared retaliation. The clerk's hands trembled slightly as the growing stack of documents reached the judge's bench. Judge Carter examined the first pages carefully. Her expression became increasingly serious. She looked toward Victor's attorney. "Counselor, have these documents been disclosed during discovery?" "No, Your Honor." "Have you ever seen them before today?" "No," Victor interrupted. "They could be fabricated." Elijah calmly met his eyes. "If they are, every seal, every signature, every archived filing number, and every witness listed can be independently verified." Victor's attorney reached for one of the copies being passed to the defense table. His face grew pale. He quickly flipped through several pages. Each document contained official stamps, original dates, certified records, cross-referenced property maps. Nothing appeared random. Nothing appeared altered. The attorney slowly looked up. "Victor, what? We've got matching parcel numbers." Victor frowned. "So, they match the county records." Victor's jaw tightened. "That doesn't prove anything." Before his attorney could answer, the courtroom doors opened once again. A gray-haired woman entered quietly, supported by a cane. She paused near the entrance, her eyes immediately finding Elijah. Tears filled her eyes. She whispered softly, almost to herself, "You kept your promise." Elijah offered a gentle smile and inclined his head. The woman turned toward Judge Carter. "Your Honor," she said, her voice shaking with emotion, "my name is Sarah Whitmore, and everything Mr. Brooks just told this court is true. I was there the day my family lost our home, and I have been waiting 20 years to tell the truth." Sarah Whitmore slowly made her way toward the witness stand, every step measured but determined. The courtroom remained so quiet that the soft tap of her cane echoed across the polished floor. The clerk helped her take the oath, and once she was seated, she looked first at Elijah Brooks before turning her attention to Judge Naomi Carter. "I never thought this day would come," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "I thought the truth would die with the people who tried to protect it." Judge Carter nodded gently. "Take your time, Mrs. Whitmore." Sarah took a slow breath. 20 years ago, my husband and I owned a small piece of land that had been in our family for 3 generations. It wasn't worth millions, but it was our home. We planned to leave it to our children. She glanced briefly toward Victor Langston. Then one morning, we received papers claiming we'd agreed to sell it. Victor's attorney immediately stood. Objection, Your Honor. This testimony concerns events from decades ago. Judge Carter remained composed. Overruled. Continue. Sarah folded her hands tightly together. We never signed those papers. We hired a lawyer, but we couldn't afford a long legal fight. Witnesses disappeared. Records were suddenly missing. We were told there wasn't enough evidence to prove fraud. She smiled sadly at Elijah. Everyone gave up, except him. The room turned toward Elijah once more. Sarah continued, Mr. Brooks told us that justice isn't measured by how quickly it arrives. He promised us that if evidence ever surfaced, he would return it to the court, no matter how many years had passed. Elijah lowered his eyes, saying nothing. Judge Carter asked, Did you personally provide documents to Mr. Brooks? Yes, Your Honor. What kind of documents? My husband's handwritten journal. A murmur swept through the courtroom. Sarah reached into her handbag and carefully removed an old notebook with faded blue covers. I've kept this with me ever since. The clerk carried it to the judge. Judge Carter opened the fragile pages carefully. Inside were dated entries describing meetings with surveyors, unexpected visits from company representatives, and repeated warnings from neighbors that powerful investors wanted the surrounding land. One page caught her attention. She read silently before looking up. This entry mentions a man named Daniel Pierce. Victor's attorney stiffened. Sarah nodded. He was the county records supervisor. The attorney quickly whispered to Victor. Victor's eyes widened. I thought he was dead. He is, the attorney whispered back, but his signature isn't. Judge Carter turned another page. Attached inside the notebook was a folded photocopy of an official memorandum bearing Pierce's signature. The judge compared it with one of the documents Elijah had submitted. Her expression became increasingly serious. The signatures appear identical. Victor immediately rose to his feet. Your Honor, handwriting similarities don't establish fraud. No, Judge Carter replied calmly, but they justify closer examination. She handed both documents to the court's forensic document examiner, who had been seated near the front for the trial. I'd like your preliminary opinion. The expert adjusted his glasses and carefully studied both signatures, examining the ink patterns, spacing, and writing pressure with a magnifying lens. Several tense minutes passed. No one spoke. Finally, the examiner looked up. Your Honor, this is only a preliminary observation. Go ahead. The signature appears genuine. Victor let out a quiet breath of relief. Then the examiner continued, but the document itself raises significant concerns. The signature was placed on a page whose printed text appears to have been produced at a different time. If laboratory testing confirms what I'm seeing, it would suggest that an authentic signature was transferred onto a completely different document. A wave of shocked whispers spread through the courtroom. Victor's confident expression vanished completely. For the first time since the hearing began, he wasn't thinking about winning. He was thinking about how many people in that courtroom suddenly realized the old man they had mocked hadn't come to tell a story. He had come to uncover the truth. Victor Langston remained standing for a moment, gripping the edge of the defense table so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The confident smile that had greeted the morning was gone, replaced by a look of calculation. He glanced toward his attorney, silently demanding an explanation that never came. Judge Naomi Carter looked toward the forensic examiner. Can laboratory testing confirm your observations? Yes, Your Honor, the examiner replied. With the court's permission, I can perform a complete analysis. However, based on my experience, the inconsistencies are significant enough to warrant immediate concern. Judge Carter nodded. The request is granted. Victor's attorney rose once more. Your Honor, we respectfully ask for a recess until the examination is complete. Before the judge could answer, Elijah spoke for the first time in several minutes. There won't be any need to wait. Every eye turned toward him. Judge Carter regarded him with quiet curiosity. What do you mean, Mr. Brooks? Elijah gently opened another section of the worn leather folder. Unlike the first stack of documents, this compartment was secured with an old brass clasp. He carefully released it and removed a sealed envelope that had yellowed with age. I hoped these papers would never be necessary, he said softly. But I made a promise to the families who trusted me. He handed the envelope to the court clerk. Written across the front, in neat handwriting, were the words, "To be opened only if justice requires it." The courtroom grew perfectly silent. Judge Carter broke the seal. Inside were several photographs, a certified affidavit, and a small cassette tape preserved inside a protective case. A reporter near the back whispered, "A tape." The judge examined the affidavit first. Her eyebrows lifted. This statement was signed by Daniel Pierce. Victor's attorney froze. "That's impossible." Judge Carter looked up. "It was notarized 6 months before Mr. Pierce passed away." The attorney slowly sat back down. Victor leaned toward him. "What does it say?" The attorney swallowed hard. I don't know yet." Judge Carter continued reading. The silence became almost unbearable. Finally, she looked toward Elijah. "Mr. Brooks, according to this affidavit, Mr. Pierce admitted that he was pressured into altering county property records." A gasp swept through the courtroom. Sarah Whitmore closed her eyes, tears rolling down her cheeks. Judge Carter continued reading aloud. "I have lived with this guilt for years. Several innocent families lost everything because powerful individuals manipulated official documents. I fear speaking publicly while I am alive, but I cannot leave this world without telling the truth." Victor shook his head. "No." The judge turned another page. "Copies of the original records have been entrusted to attorney Elijah Brooks because he is the only person I believe will protect them until the proper time." Every person in the courtroom slowly turned toward Elijah. He stood quietly, offering no expression of triumph. Judge Carter carefully lifted the cassette tape. "What is this?" Elijah answered calmly. "The final interview I conducted with Mr. Pierce after he signed that affidavit." Victor immediately stood. "I object. We have no proof that recording is authentic." Judge Carter nodded. "A fair concern." She looked toward the court technician. "Can we verify whether the recording has remained sealed?" The technician examined the evidence bag. "The seal appears original, Your Honor. There are no signs it has ever been opened." Judge Carter looked at both legal teams. "Unless there is a valid legal objection to authenticity, the court will hear the recording." Victor's attorney lowered his head. He knew the rules. He also knew there was no immediate legal basis to stop it. Judge Carter gave a single nod. The technician placed the cassette into an old playback machine kept for archived evidence. The room became silent once again. A soft hiss filled the speakers. Then an elderly man's voice emerged, weak but unmistakably clear. "My name is Daniel Pierce, and if you are hearing this, it means Elijah Brooks has finally kept the promise we made together." The courtroom seemed to stop breathing. No one shifted in their seat. No one whispered. The only sound was the faint crackle of the old cassette as Daniel Pierce's voice filled the room. "I served as county records supervisor for nearly 28 years, the recording continued. "I believed my duty was to protect the truth, but I failed." The man's voice paused, followed by a deep, shaky breath. "I let fear overcome my conscience." Victor Langston stared at the speaker on the evidence table, his face drained of color. Daniel continued. "There were meetings held after business hours. Property files were removed from the archives, altered, and returned before sunrise. I was told no one would ever know." The courtroom listened in complete silence. "I refused at first." Another pause. "Then I was threatened. They said my family would lose everything if I didn't cooperate." Sarah Whitmore quietly wiped away another tear. Daniel's voice grew heavier. "I watched honest families lose homes that had belonged to them for generations." The tape clicked softly before continuing. "I kept copies of every original document because someday, someone had to know what really happened." Judge Carter glanced toward Elijah. He stood motionless, his hands folded in front of him, listening to the recording as though hearing an old friend's final confession once again. Daniel spoke again. "If you're listening to this, Elijah, thank you." Several people in the gallery lowered their heads. "You told me that truth doesn't disappear just because powerful people bury it." His voice cracked with emotion. "You promised me that when the time was right, justice would finally have its day." The recording ended with several seconds of silence before the tape stopped spinning. No one spoke. Even Victor's attorney remained frozen, unable to find words. Finally, Judge Carter broke the silence. "The recording will be admitted into evidence pending full authentication." Victor suddenly pushed back his chair. "This is ridiculous." Every eye turned toward him. "My company didn't even exist 20 years ago." Judge Carter looked at him carefully. "Your company may not have." Victor seized on the statement. "Exactly. But this court has already received evidence suggesting that several of the disputed properties were later transferred into corporations eventually acquired by your development group." Victor's expression tightened. His attorney slowly closed his eyes. The judge continued. "Whether those transactions were lawful remains one of the central questions before this court." Victor slammed both hands onto the table. "I bought those properties legally. Elijah finally spoke. Did you ever ask how they became available? Victor looked directly at him. I trusted the records. So did the families who lost everything. The words landed harder than anyone expected. Victor looked away first. Judge Carter turned toward the court clerk. Please call the next witness. The clerk glanced at the file. Your Honor, the next witness is Thomas Reynolds. The rear courtroom doors opened. A man in his early 60s entered wearing a simple gray suit. His shoulders were slightly bent, and his expression carried the weight of years spent avoiding difficult memories. Victor's eyes widened. No, his attorney whispered urgently. You know him. Victor didn't answer. Thomas Reynolds slowly approached the witness stand. After taking the oath, he looked directly at Victor. I've waited a long time for this. Judge Carter asked gently. Mr. Reynolds, what was your occupation 20 years ago? I worked as an accountant. For whom? Thomas hesitated. His eyes briefly closed. For the company that handled the financial transactions behind those land purchases. A wave of whispers swept through the courtroom. Judge Carter leaned forward. And why have you come forward today? Thomas reached inside his briefcase and removed a thick ledger bound in faded black leather. He placed it carefully on the witness stand. Because I've spent 20 years carrying the guilt of what these pages contain. He opened the ledger to a marked section. I recorded every payment. He looked at Victor one final time. And every bribe. Thomas Reynolds' final words hung in the courtroom like a thunderclap. And every bribe. A collective gasp swept through the gallery. Reporters immediately began writing furiously, while the attorneys exchanged stunned glances. Even the court clerk paused, her pen suspended above the record. Victor Langston slowly rose to his feet. That's a lie. Thomas didn't flinch. I wish it were. Victor pointed an accusing finger across the courtroom. You're trying to save yourself. Thomas sighed deeply. For 20 years, that's exactly what I did. He rested one hand on the worn ledger. I convinced myself that I was just an accountant. I wasn't forging signatures. I wasn't threatening families. I was only recording numbers. He shook his head. But numbers tell stories. Judge Carter nodded. Please explain. Thomas carefully opened the ledger to a page marked with a faded ribbon. Every legitimate property purchase was entered in blue ink. He turned another page. But whenever money was paid to influence officials, intimidate witnesses, or disguise ownership, I was instructed to use black ink and assign a coded reference. The judge examined the page. I see both colors. Thomas pointed to a column. These initials represent the recipients. Victor's attorney stood. Objection. This witness is making conclusions. Thomas calmly answered before the judge could rule. They're not conclusions. He removed a folded sheet from inside the ledger. This is the code key. Judge Carter accepted the document. The courtroom leaned forward as she unfolded it. Each set of initials corresponded to names, positions, and payment descriptions. The first several entries listed county employees. Others referred to consultants and shell companies. Then Judge Carter stopped reading. Her expression hardened. She looked directly at Victor. This final code, Thomas nodded slowly. It identifies the executive who approved the payments. Victor immediately interrupted. Anyone could have written that. Thomas met his gaze. I did. You expect this court to believe you kept evidence against yourself? No. Thomas looked toward Elijah. I expected Mr. Brooks to destroy it. Every eye turned to Elijah once again. Thomas smiled sadly. I begged him to burn everything. Elijah quietly replied, and I told you that truth isn't something we own. It's something we protect. Thomas lowered his head. He was right. Judge Carter continued reviewing the ledger. The dates correspond with the documents already admitted. The forensic examiner stepped forward. Your Honor, may I compare the ink aging with the journal and affidavit? You may. For several tense minutes, the expert carefully examined the materials. Finally, he looked up. My preliminary opinion is that the documents were created during the same general time period. I see no obvious indication of recent fabrication. Victor's shoulders slumped. His attorney whispered urgently. We're losing control of this. Victor stared straight ahead. There has to be something. The attorney remained silent. He had run out of reassuring answers. Judge Carter looked toward Thomas. Why testify now? Thomas's eyes filled with tears. My grandson asked me last month what I was most proud of. The room grew still. I couldn't answer him. He swallowed hard. I realized I'd spent 20 years protecting my reputation instead of protecting innocent people. He looked at Sarah Whitmore. I'm sorry. Then he turned toward Elijah. And I'm sorry it took me this long to find the courage you showed all those years ago. Elijah gave a small nod. The important thing is that you found it. Just then, The courtroom doors opened once more. A uniformed court officer hurried inside carrying a sealed envelope. He approached the judge's bench. "Your Honor, this has just arrived from the state archives." Judge Carter accepted the package. The accompanying letter says these records were discovered during a storage inventory completed this morning. She carefully broke the seal. Inside lay several original county property maps bearing official certification stamps. She unfolded the first map, and within seconds her expression changed completely. She looked up at Victor Langston and said quietly, "It appears the original property boundaries were deliberately altered." The courtroom erupted into shocked whispers as the true scale of the deception began to emerge. The courtroom buzzed with anxious whispers until Judge Naomi Carter struck her gavel once. "Order." The room fell silent again. She spread the newly discovered property maps across the evidence table, inviting both legal teams to examine them. The faded survey lines stretched across acres of farmland, each boundary carefully marked with official county seals that had survived decades in storage. The forensic examiner adjusted his glasses and leaned over the maps. After several minutes of careful comparison, he looked toward the bench. "Your Honor, these appear to be the original certified surveys." Judge Carter nodded. "How do they compare with the versions submitted during the disputed property transfers?" "They're different." A murmur swept through the courtroom. The examiner continued, pointing to several marked locations. "These original boundaries include parcels belonging to the Whitmore family and several neighboring landowners. In the later versions, the property lines were shifted." He traced one altered line with a pencil, just enough to make it appear that the disputed land had been legally included in the development purchase. Sarah Whitmore covered her mouth with both hands. "My father's orchard." The examiner nodded gently. "It was never legally part of the sale." Tears rolled down Sarah's face as years of unanswered questions suddenly found their answer. Victor Langston's attorney slowly removed his glasses. He no longer looked confident. He looked defeated. Victor leaned toward him. "Say something." The attorney stared at the maps. "I don't think there's anything left to say." Victor's breathing became uneven. "I didn't draw those maps." "No, but your company profited from them." Judge Carter folded her hands. "The court recognizes that determining individual criminal liability falls outside today's civil proceedings." She paused. "However, these documents significantly affect the ownership claims before this court." Elijah remained standing quietly beside the evidence table, saying nothing. He had not interrupted. He had not celebrated. He simply watched the truth unfold. Judge Carter looked toward him. "Mr. Brooks." "Yes, Your Honor. Without your preservation of these records, would these original surveys likely have been discovered?" Elijah considered the question before answering. "I honestly don't know." The judge smiled faintly. "I believe I do." She turned toward the courtroom. "Justice often depends on ordinary people choosing not to give up." Several young law students seated in the gallery quietly nodded. One of them whispered, "I'll never forget this." Judge Carter reviewed her notes one final time before looking directly at Victor Langston. "Mr. Langston." He slowly stood. "This court finds that the evidence presented today overwhelmingly demonstrates serious irregularities in the historical transfer of the disputed properties." Victor closed his eyes. Judge Carter continued, "The ownership claims asserted by your company cannot stand without further review." The courtroom remained completely silent. Accordingly, she paused. "This court orders that all disputed property transfers related to this action be suspended immediately pending comprehensive review." A wave of emotion spread through the families seated behind Sarah Whitmore. Some embraced, others quietly cried. Judge Carter wasn't finished. "The court further orders that copies of today's evidence be referred to the appropriate investigative authorities for additional examination." Victor lowered his head. His empire, built on confidence and influence, suddenly felt fragile. He looked across the room at Elijah. "You could have exposed this years ago." Elijah answered gently, "I tried." Victor frowned. "What do you mean?" "I brought concerns forward, and no one wanted to listen to a lawyer representing families who couldn't afford expensive attorneys." Victor looked around the courtroom. The irony was impossible to ignore. Only hours earlier, he had made exactly the same mistake. He had judged the quiet old man by his worn coat instead of the truth he carried. As the hearing drew toward its conclusion, Judge Carter looked at Elijah once more. "Mr. Brooks." She smiled with unmistakable respect. "On behalf of every family whose voice was nearly forgotten, thank you for refusing to let the truth disappear." The courtroom remained quiet long after Judge Naomi Carter's words faded. No one hurried toward the doors. The reporters who normally rushed to be first outside stayed in their seats, sensing that the most meaningful moment had not yet happened. Families who had spent decades believing they would never be heard looked at one another with tearful smiles. Some held hands, others embraced in silence. The burden they had carried for so many years finally felt lighter. Elijah Brooks quietly gathered the documents from the evidence table. One by one, he returned each photograph, affidavit, survey, and letter to the worn leather folder that had been dismissed as worthless only a few hours earlier. He handled every page with the same care he had shown when preserving them for decades. As he fastened the brass clasp, he felt someone standing beside him. It was bailiff Marcus Reed. Marcus removed his cap and lowered his head. "Mr. Brooks." Elijah looked up with a warm smile. "Yes, I owe you an apology." Elijah waited patiently. "When you arrived this morning, I looked at your coat, your shoes, and that old folder. I assumed you didn't belong here." His voice grew heavier. "I never asked your name. I never gave you the respect every person deserves." Elijah placed a gentle hand on the bailiff's shoulder. "You treated me the way many people are taught to judge. The important thing is that you learned something before the day ended." Marcus nodded, his eyes shining with emotion. "I won't make that mistake again." Nearby, Judge Carter stepped down from the bench and walked toward Elijah. The attorneys respectfully moved aside to give them space. "There is something I've wanted to say for many years," she said. Elijah smiled. "You've already said enough today." She shook her head. "No." She took a slow breath. "When I was a young law student, I once told you that I didn't think I was good enough to become a judge." Elijah chuckled softly. "I remember. You told me that justice isn't about being the smartest person in the room. It's about having the courage to do what's right when it's hardest." She smiled through tears. "I've carried those words with me every day since." Elijah's eyes softened. "And you've honored them." Before either could say another word, a small boy, no older than 10, stepped cautiously toward Elijah. He was holding his grandmother's hand, Sarah Whitmore's grandson. The boy looked up with wide, curious eyes. "Excuse me, sir." Elijah knelt so they were eye to eye. "Yes." The boy hesitated. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course. If everyone respected you so much." He glanced around the courtroom. "Why didn't you tell them who you were when they laughed at you?" The question lingered in the air. Even the reporters stopped writing. Elijah smiled gently. "Because if I had needed my name to earn kindness." He looked around the courtroom at every face watching him. "Then the lesson would have been lost." The boy frowned thoughtfully. "I don't understand." Elijah pointed toward the courtroom doors where people of every background now stood together. "Every person deserves respect before anyone knows their story." The boy slowly nodded. "I think I understand now." Sarah wiped away another tear. "You've taught him something he'll remember for the rest of his life." Elijah stood and picked up the worn leather folder once more. As he walked toward the exit, dozens of people instinctively stepped aside, creating a clear path. Not because anyone ordered them to, but because genuine respect had replaced the careless judgments of the morning. No applause echoed through the courtroom. No grand celebration interrupted the silence. Only grateful eyes followed the humble old man whose greatest achievement had never been winning a case. It had been reminding everyone that true dignity is revealed not by titles, wealth, or appearance, but by the quiet courage to stand for the truth when no one else will. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the courthouse windows as Elijah Brooks stepped into the hallway, the worn leather folder resting beneath his arm exactly as it had when he arrived that morning. Outside the courtroom, reporters gathered almost instantly, microphones in hand and cameras pointed toward the quiet man whose name had suddenly become the center of every headline. "Mr. Brooks, will you make a statement? Did you know today's evidence would change the case? What do you plan to do next?" Elijah stopped for a moment and looked at the crowd. There was no pride in his expression, no desire to enjoy the attention that had finally found him. He simply smiled. "I don't believe today was about me." One reporter stepped forward. "Then who was it about?" "The families who waited years to be heard." Another voice called out, "Do you feel vindicated after being underestimated this morning?" Elijah glanced back toward the courtroom door. "I've learned that people often judge what they can see before they understand what they cannot." The reporters listened carefully. "But every person has a story you know nothing about. If today reminds even one person to show kindness before making assumptions, then this day has accomplished more than any court ruling." His words were met with thoughtful silence. A few steps away, Victor Langston slowly emerged from the courtroom with his attorney. Gone was the confident businessman who had entered surrounded by power and certainty. His shoulders were lowered, and the expression on his face revealed a man confronting truths he had spent years avoiding. He noticed Elijah preparing to leave. For a long moment, he hesitated. Then he walked toward him. The reporters quickly turned their cameras. Victor stopped a few feet away. "I owe you something." Elijah waited. "An apology." He looked down before continuing. "When I first saw you, I decided exactly who you were without speaking to you." He managed a faint, embarrassed smile. "I thought your old coat told me everything I needed to know." Elijah's expression remained kind. "It didn't." Victor nodded. "No." He looked around at the families gathered in the hallway. "I've spent my life believing success meant winning." He paused. "Today I realized it means being worthy of the trust people place in you." Neither man spoke for several seconds. Finally, Elijah extended his hand. Victor accepted it. "I'm not asking you to forget what happened," Victor said quietly. "I wouldn't. And I'm not asking you to excuse it." Elijah gently squeezed his hand before letting go. "Then begin by making different choices tomorrow than you made yesterday." Victor nodded slowly. "I will." As Elijah walked toward the courthouse exit, Sarah Whitmore and several other families waited outside beneath the courthouse steps. Some carried old family photographs recovered during the investigation. Others simply wanted the chance to thank the man who had never forgotten them. Sarah embraced Elijah. "You gave us our voices back." He smiled warmly. "No." He looked around at the gathered families. "You never lost your voices. You only needed someone willing to listen." The families watched as Elijah continued down the sidewalk alone, disappearing into the busy afternoon crowd. He carried no trophy, accepted no praise, and sought no recognition. The worn leather folder remained tucked beneath his arm, just another old folder to strangers passing by. None of them knew they had just walked past a man whose quiet determination had restored justice to dozens of families and reminded an entire courtroom that appearances can deceive, but character cannot. And perhaps that was exactly how Elijah Brooks wanted it. Because he had always believed the greatest legacy a person could leave behind was not wealth, influence, or fame, but the simple courage to do what was right even when no one was watching. If this story moved you, remember its lesson wherever you go. Treat every person with dignity before you know their name, because the quietest stranger in the room may be carrying a story powerful enough to change your life.